January 27, 1943. Just after dark, the frozen approaches to Bely, in the Smolensk region of the Kalinin Front, a 20-year-old former penal battalion soldier named Vladimir Karpov lay flat in the snow, watching a German trench line he could not yet see clearly, waiting for the cold to stop being the thing he noticed most. 9 months earlier, Karpov hadn't been a soldier with a rifle platoon at all. He'd been a military academy cadet in Tashkent, arrested weeks before graduation on a political charge, and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. In November 1942, he'd been sent to the front not as a punished man forgiven, but as one still serving his sentence, assigned to the 45th Penal Company on the Kalinin Front, one of the Red Army's Strafbat units, where convicted men were given rifles instead of prison years, and told that survival, or not time served, was how the sentence ended. He survived long enough to be noticed. By early 1943, he'd been transferred out of the Penal Company into something far more selective, a foot reconnaissance platoon of the 629th Rifle Regiment, 134th Rifle Division, one of the small, specially trained units the Red Army used for a specific and brutally dangerous job. Not scouting from a distance, crossing into German-held ground in the dark, in near silence, to bring back what Soviet intelligence needed most and struggled hardest to get: a living prisoner who could be interrogated. In Red Army slang, the men who did this were called language hunters. The prisoner himself was the language, yazyk. This was not a rare, one-off tactic. It was a routine, standardized, and heavily practiced discipline on the Eastern Front by 1943, defined over 18 months of brutal trial and error since Barbarossa began in June 1941. Soviet reconnaissance doctrine called for these raids constantly, on quiet sectors as much as active ones, because Red Army commanders needed a continuous flow of fresh, verified intelligence on exactly which German units were where, what shape they were in, and what they knew. Information a captured private or corporal, properly interrogated, could hand over far faster than any aerial photograph. Before I tell you what Karpov and his platoon actually did that night, and what it set in motion, I want to ask you something, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets lost between the huge, famous battles most channels cover. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. These small unit stories rarely survive anywhere except in family memory and buried unit records, and I'd genuinely like to know who's still carrying them. Now, back to the wire. Karpov's platoon moved in the way these units were trained to move. Not fast, not in a rush toward the objective, but at a crawl pace to match the wind, so that any sound their bodies made was covered by the sound the weather was already making. Soviet reconnaissance training in this period placed enormous emphasis on exactly this kind of patience. Hours spent motionless in freezing conditions, studying a single stretch of enemy wire, timing sentry rotations, memorizing where trip flares and listening posts had been placed, before a single man moved a meter closer. According to the documented unit record, Order No. 5N of the 629th Rifle Regiment dated the following day, January 28, 1943. Karpov's group breached the German wire obstacles, engaged and killed enemy soldiers holding the position, and successfully captured a prisoner for interrogation. For that single night's work, Karpov was awarded the Medal for Courage. More significantly for him personally, his conduct in this raid was cited days later when his criminal conviction was formally expunged in February 1943. The penal sentence lifted specifically because of what he'd done crossing that wire in the dark. But a single successful raid, however well documented, doesn't answer the bigger question this title is really asking. What did it actually do to the German soldiers on the other side of that wire? Night after night, raid after raid, all along a front line stretching more than 1,000 miles. Because Karpov's platoon was not unique. It was one of hundreds of similar reconnaissance units the Red Army fielded, and their cumulative effect on German frontline morale, documented in Wehrmacht unit diaries, security directives, and post-war German military assessments, became one of the most persistent, and least publicly known psychological pressures of the entire Eastern Front spring and summer 1943. The German-held sector opposite the Kalinin and Western fronts By the time Karpov's platoon had settled into its rhythm of raids, fire language hunting wasn't an improvised trick some clever unit had stumbled onto. It was doctrine, one of the most systematized night combat practices in the entire Red Army found, and one the Wehrmacht had been forced to take seriously since the earliest months of the invasion. To understand why it worked as well as it did, you have to understand what German frontline defense actually looked like by 1943. After nearly 2 years of war on a front stretching over 1,000 miles, German infantry divisions were spread thin, holding sectors with far fewer men per kilometer than doctrine called for. That meant trench lines with gaps, postens manned exhausted soldiers doing multiple duty shifts, and, critically, a defensive posture built around expecting the next major threat to be tanks and artillery, not 2 or 3 men crawling through no man's land in total silence to drag a sentry back across the line alive. German army security directives from this period, preserved in captured Wehrmacht records reviewed after the war, show a consistent and escalating concern with exactly this problem. Units were repeatedly ordered to increase wire density, add secondary listening posts, rotate sentries more frequently, and lay additional mines, specifically to counter Soviet infiltration patrols. Measures that cost manpower, time, and materials the German army increasingly could not spare on every sector of an enormous front. That is the real, measurable fingerprint these raids left in the historical record. Not a single dramatic quote, but a documented pattern of German units diverting scarce defensive resources toward a threat that arrived in silence, took what it came for, and vanished before a full alarm could even be raised. Karpov's own service record through 1943 shows exactly how this pressure was applied, raid after raid on one small stretch of front. On August 15, 1943, during a German counterattack, he personally directed artillery fire onto advancing enemy armor and infantry, an action credited in his unit's citation with helping destroy German armored vehicles and roughly 70 enemy soldiers in that single engagement. 2 days later, on August 17, 1943, he was wounded. He recovered, returned to his platoon, and kept working. By November 1943, his reconnaissance unit was operating in the drive toward Vitebsk, in what is now Belarus, conducting the same style of deep infiltration raids that had defined his war since Bely, crossing into German-held territory, gathering intelligence on troop positions and strength, and bringing back prisoners for interrogation. For his conduct during that period, he received the Order of the Red Banner in February 1944. None of this happened in isolation. Karpov was one platoon commander among what Soviet military archives describe as a standing reconnaissance apparatus present in nearly every rifle division on the Eastern Front, meaning that on any given night, across the entire length of German-Soviet contact, multiple Red Army units were attempting exactly this kind of raid somewhere along the line. The cumulative psychological effect on German frontline troops, forced to treat every quiet night as a possible infiltration rather than arrest, is something post-war German military historians and former Wehrmacht officers writing in post-war studies for Allied and later NATO military institutions consistently identified as a genuine drain on frontline readiness and morale. Distinct from, and in some ways more corrosive than, the fear of a large-scale Soviet offensive, because it never fully went away even on the quietest sectors. Then, in the late spring of 1944, Karpov's war took its most extraordinary turn. Not a raid across a trench line under covering fire, but something closer to what modern audiences would recognize as a deep penetration intelligence mission. On direct assignment from Colonel General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, commander of the 3rd Belarusian Front, Karpov disguised himself in a captured German uniform and crossed the front line into German-occupied Vitebsk itself to make contact with local partisans and retrieve documents, including photographed defensive positions that Soviet planners needed for the coming summer offensive. He got the documents out. He was seriously wounded doing it, hit by enemy fire while making his way back across the line with the intelligence still on him. He delivered it anyway. For his cumulative record, the dozens of night raids, the prisoners taken for interrogation, and the Vitebsk mission, Vladimir Karpov was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union on June 4, 1944. By the time the war ended, Soviet military records credit him personally with helping capture 79 German prisoners across roughly 2 years of continuous reconnaissance work. Men whose interrogations fed directly into the intelligence picture Red Army commanders used to plan entire offensives. Front. That is what Shocked actually looked like on the Eastern Front. Not a single dramatic night. A sustained, years-long campaign of small, disciplined, almost invisible raids that German command could never fully stop. And one former convict, sent to the front to serve out a prison sentence, who became one of its most decorated practitioners, 1944 to 1945. The push west, from Vitebsk to the edge of the Reich. After Vitebsk, Karpov's role in the war changed. A soldier who had spent 2 years crawling through wire in the dark, who had gone into occupied territory in a German uniform and come back wounded with photographs of enemy defenses hidden on him, was no longer just useful at the front. He was useful to the institution training the next generation of scouts. Following his recovery, he was promoted to senior lieutenant and transferred, in late 1944, to the higher reconnaissance school of the Soviet General Staff. The man who'd once been a Strafpat soldier, serving out a 5-year political sentence, was now teaching the tradecraft that had earned him a gold star. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something the raw statistics can't. The Red Army's reconnaissance apparatus wasn't built around a handful of legendary individuals, for it was built to be teachable, a repeatable discipline of patience, timing, and controlled violence that could be passed from one platoon to the next, division to division, all along a front that stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Karpov was exceptional, but the system that produced him was designed to produce more like him, indefinitely, for as long as the war required it. That's the part of this story that matters most, and it's also the part almost never gets told, because it doesn't have a single dramatic climax. It's not a battle with a start and an end. It's a pressure that simply never stopped. German frontline units on the Eastern Front spent close to 4 years never fully able to relax on a quiet night, because a quiet night was exactly when a Soviet reconnaissance platoon was most likely to be lying in the snow outside their wire, watching sentry rotations, timing the wind. Every division that diverted men, mines, and wire to shore up its rear listening posts against infiltration was a division with fewer resources. For the offensive the Red Army was eventually going to launch anyway. Every prisoner dragged back across no man's land under interrogation gave Soviet planners one more piece of a puzzle they were building toward Operation Bagration, the massive summer 1944 offensive that shattered Army Group Center and remains, by most measures, one of the most catastrophic single defeats the German army suffered in the entire war. Karpov's own unit, the 39th Army, under the 3rd Belarusian Front, was directly involved in that offensive. The same push toward Vitebsk his intelligence-gathering mission had helped prepare for. It's not an exaggeration to say that the documents he carried back across the line in the spring of 1944, hidden under a German uniform, fed into planning for one of the largest and most successful Soviet operations of the entire war. He survived it all. Karpov lived through the rest of the war, graduated from the Franz Military Academy in 1947, and spent nearly a decade working inside Soviet military intelligence itself, the GRU, before commanding troops in Central Asia and retiring as a colonel in 1966. He then became a serious literary figure, writing novels and non-fiction about the war he'd lived through, including an autobiographical work about reconnaissance souls that later became a Soviet television miniseries. He died in Moscow on January 18, 2010, at the age of 87. One of the last living men who could describe firsthand what it actually felt like to lie motionless in the snow outside a German trench line, close enough to hear voices, waiting for the exact right second to move. That's the true story behind a title like The Night Soviet Scouts Shocked the German Lines. There wasn't one night. There were thousands of them, spread across a front longer than the distance from New York to Denver, carried out by platoons whose names mostly never made it into any history book at all. Vladimir Karpov's record survives only because the paperwork survived. A medal citation here, a wound record there, a hero of the Soviet Union decree with a specific date on it. Most of the men who did exactly what he did, on exactly as many nights, left no paper trail at all. We simply know they existed because the German army's own defensive planning had to account for them, sector by sector for 4 straight years. That's what actually shocked the German lines. Not a single raid. A discipline that never let up, carried by men the war took from prison camps and penal companies and turned, one patient crawl through the wire at a time, into the reason an entire army group could never fully sleep. If stories like this, the quiet, unglamorous, unbelievably dangerous work that doesn't get a movie made about it, are what you want more of, right, this channel is going to keep finding them. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it's exactly what decides which story gets told next.